What is a credible fear interview and what should you do to prepare for it? Well, in this training, I'm going to tell you what you need to know if you want to get asylum in the United States and the government has told you that you're going to have a credible fear interview. Now, I did hundreds of these interviews when I was an asylum officer with the government, and I'm going to share with you today insights from the other side of the desk. If we're just not meeting, I'm Brian Manning, and my law firm, Manning Asylum Law, helps people all over the country secure their future in the United States through political asylum. Now, for many people, the road to asylum starts with a credible fear interview, but most people really have no idea what this extremely important interview is or how to increase their chances for success at it by properly preparing. Now, to help you, I put together this training. So let's jump over to my computer now so that I can provide you all the information you need in a way that I think will help you to remember it. Hey there, and welcome to the Credible Fear Interview Training brought to you by Manning Asylum Law. That's me, Brian Manning, that you're seeing on your screen right now. And my law firm, Manning Asylum Law, is based in Houston, Texas, but we help people all over the country to secure their future in the United States through asylum. And today's topic is the Credible Fear Interview. Now, this training is divided into 4 parts. In part 1, I'm going to provide you with some of the basics, like what a credible fear interview is and who they're done for. And in part 2, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen at your credible fear interview. I'm going to walk you through all the steps from beginning to end so you'll know what to expect the day of your interview. Next, in part 3 of this training, I'm going to reveal for you what it is that the officer really wants to know. I'll tell you what information they're really trying to get out of you with all the questions they're going to ask at your interview. This is key because it'll help you prepare in a way that will allow you to give the officer exactly what they need in order to give you a positive decision. Finally, in part 4 of this training, I'm going to share with you insights from my time on the other side of the desk. I'm going to give you some tips about how to answer questions during your interview. And this is based off of my observations from the many credible fear interviews that I performed when I was an asylum officer with the government. And I think you'll really appreciate some of these perspectives, and I don't think that you'll find these elsewhere. Does that sound good? Are you ready to get started? Great. Okay, last thing before we turn to the credible fear interview training. This is not legal advice, and it's not a legal service. It's general information of an educational nature. All right, now with that out of the way, let's get started. Okay, part 1 of the credible fear interview training, and we're going to cover some of the basics concerning a credible fear interview so that you know what you're getting into. First, what is a credible fear interview? Well, it's an interview where an asylum officer asks you questions about what has happened to you and why it is that you fear you could be harmed if you had to return to your country. It's done for the purpose of determining whether you may qualify for protection here in the United States. So, who gets a credible fear interview? Well, a credible fear interview is held for people whom government deportation officials have encountered and would have deported right away, but for the person saying they fear being harmed in their country. You see, people who are arriving in the United States, whether at an airport or at a land border crossing checkpoint, but whom the authorities determine aren't eligible to enter the country, normally don't get to stay here and fight their case in immigration court proceedings. Often, the government says the person can't come in or can't stay here because the person doesn't have a valid visa, or if they do have one, the government believes the person will violate the terms of that visa. People in this position can be sent back to their country almost immediately, often within a matter of days. This is called expedited removal. It often happens to people who come to the border and tell the U.S. border agent that they want to seek asylum, as well as to people who say this to a Customs and Border Protection officer when they arrive at the airport in the United States. And the same thing happens to people who enter the country illegally and are caught. They're subjected to expedited removal. But you see, if someone who is subject to expedited removal tells the U.S. authorities that they fear being harmed in their own country, then the U.S. government will hear them out. They'll hold off on deporting the person right away. It's kind of like they hit the pause button, at least long enough to give the person's claim of fear cursory consideration. And that's the purpose of the credible fear interview, to give the person a chance to explain why they fear being harmed, and for the asylum officer to determine whether the person might have a shot at qualifying for asylum or another form of humanitarian protection in the United States. Now, that's pretty much the same as what happens at an asylum interview. So, what's the difference between those two things, an asylum interview and a credible fear interview? Both of which are handled by asylum officers, which is
by the way, the job that I used to do for the US government. Well, people subject to an expedited removal order can't apply for asylum and get an interview. They're ineligible to apply for asylum. Rather, they do the credible fear interview. On the other hand, if someone enters the United States with a visa or enters illegally and is not caught by immigration officials and then later decides to apply for asylum, they will have an asylum interview. The two interviews, asylum interviews and credible fear interviews, are quite similar, but the outcome is very different. After the asylum interview, the officer can actually give you asylum, but that's not the case with a credible fear interview. If you get a positive decision in a credible fear interview, you do not get asylum. Rather, you get the chance to present your case more fully in immigration court proceedings. After a positive credible fear determination, you'll get to argue your case in front of a judge where you can present evidence and even have witnesses testify in support of your case. And the judge will decide whether you get asylum or perhaps another form of protection that will allow you to stay here or will instead be deported. I should note that at the time that I'm making this training, the government is considering having people who get a positive credible fear result go on to have a full asylum interview in front of an asylum officer rather than before a judge in immigration court. So the process could change, but the idea is the same. If you get a positive result in your credible fear interview, you won't be deported immediately and you'll have a chance to fully state your case for asylum. You see, a credible fear interview is what's called a screening interview. The asylum officer is doing a fairly superficial analysis of whether your circumstances, when considered in light of applicable laws and government policy, might give rise to a viable claim, such that you should have the chance to really present your case in full. And because it's a screening interview, the officer is not actually going to give you asylum, even if they think you have a good case. Also, a credible fear interview is normally much shorter than an asylum interview. As where an asylum interview normally lasts for at least 2 hours, and does in fact routinely stretch to 3 or more hours, a credible fear interview is usually closer to an hour in duration, or perhaps 2 hours where it's done in person rather than by phone. And I'll say more about that distinction in a minute. It's pretty much the same kind of questions at both types of interviews. It's just that the credible fear interview is less in depth. The officer usually asks for fewer details, and it's easier to meet your burden of proof. And that's important to understand about your credible fear interview. There's a pretty low bar for getting a positive decision. What do I mean by that? Well, as where at an asylum interview, you've really got to convince the officer that you meet all the requirements for asylum. You can get a positive decision in a credible fear interview by being slightly less convincing. If it looks to the asylum officer like, yeah, I can imagine that this person might be able to put on a good case if they were given time to really prepare their case and to present it all in formal proceedings in front of an immigration judge, then the officer will likely give you a positive, credible fear decision. Because remember, it's a screening interview. The asylum officer is trying to weed out the cases that have virtually no shot of success, the ones where it's clear that the person can't qualify for protection under U.S. law, and to send on to the next stage the people who at least have some chance of winning their case. All right, now you know why you've been asked to do a credible fear interview, and you have some idea of the purpose of it. Let's get into the really important stuff, like what you can expect to happen the day of your interview and how to prepare for it. Okay, where and how a credible fear interview is conducted depends on whether the person is detained. Traditionally, most credible fear interviews have been held while the person is being detained by U.S. immigration officials. When that's the case, the interview is done by telephone. You're connected to an asylum officer on a conference call, and they interview you by phone. This usually happens within a few days of the person being detained, but sometimes it's much later. If the authorities decide not to detain someone, or they've detained them but then decided to let them go, then the person will have a credible fear interview in person at an asylum office. Due to changes in government policy about whom to keep detained and owing to a surge in people coming to the southern U.S. border to seek asylum, non-detained in-person credible fear interviews have become much more common of late. Lots of asylum seekers are being allowed to enter the country and are asked to come to an asylum office for their credible fear interview. These people will receive a letter from the asylum office informing them of the date and time of their scheduled interview. This letter may come within days of the person being let into the country, or it could take weeks or perhaps even longer, owing to backlogs. The letter will come to the address that you've given to the authorities when they decided to let you into the country. It's crucial that you let the government know if you change addresses, because you don't want to miss this notification letter. If you don't show up to your credible fear interview, you can be deported without getting a chance to really state your case. Now, if you're watching this video, you're likely in the non-detained group of asylum seekers who have an upcoming credible fear interview. The internet normally isn't accessible in immigration detention. So I'm going to focus for the rest of this training on the mechanics of in-person credible fear interviews rather than detained credible fear interviews. Okay, and with that, we're ready to turn to part 2 of the credible fear interview training. Okay, in part 2, I'm going to tell you exactly what you can expect to happen at your interview. This is important because so much of the anxiety that afflicts applicants stems from uncertainty. People just don't know what to expect at their interview, and this adds to their stress. And that stress makes it hard to perform well at the interview. But that won't be you. You're going to know exactly what to expect at your interview because I'm going to tell you right now how it all works. Sound good? Okay, great. Here we go. Here's what happens the day of your interview. For starters, you should arrive at the asylum office about 20 minutes before your interview is scheduled to begin. You'll go through a metal detector, and the security guard will ask you a few questions, like whether you're carrying any weapons. Next, you'll go to a waiting room where someone will take your photo and likely take your fingerprint as well. This person will ask to see the letter that says you have an appointment, as well as identification, so you must be sure to take both those things with you on the day of your appointment. If you have your passport, take that for identification. If you don't, like if the immigration authorities took it away from you, then take a scanned copy of the page of your passport that shows your photo and has your biographical information on it, if you've got such a copy. Also, take any other form of ID that you have, whether that's a national ID, a driver's license from your country, or perhaps a student or work ID card. And while we're discussing what to take with you, let me also recommend that you take a bottle of water and a snack or two, like a granola bar. You'll likely be at the asylum office for quite a while, and you don't want to be hungry. If you're hungry, you probably won't be able to focus as well, and this can negatively affect your interview. And speaking of what you'll be bringing with you to your interview, if you have children coming with you, you should bring something to keep them entertained so they disturb the interview as little as possible. Some books or quiet toys are a good idea. Okay, so back to our overview of what will happen the day of your interview. After the check-in procedures, you'll be taken to the room where your interview will take place. And you're normally going to be in the same room as the asylum officer, but if social distancing measures are in place, like because of a health pandemic, which we saw with the COVID pandemic, you'll be in your own room and the officer will be in another room, or perhaps even in a different building or at their own home. When the officer is not in the room with you, you see the officer and they see you through a tablet that's placed on the table in front of you. But the audio, how you hear the officer and how they hear you, comes through a telephone that's placed on the table and which is in speakerphone mode. The officer will introduce themselves and may do a tiny bit of small talk, but more often than not, they jump right into the interview. The first question is almost always something to the effect of, "We're having this conversation because you indicated you fear returning to your country. Are you still in fact afraid to go there?" If you are from a country where English is not the dominant language, this question and the rest of the interview will likely take place through interpretation. The officer will almost certainly already have an interpreter on the phone before you even walk in the room to interpret everything the officer says and everything you say. The officer should ask you what language you're most comfortable using. If the interpreter they've arranged ahead of time doesn't speak that language, then you should request that the officer find an interpreter who speaks your preferred language. An important note: if you do speak some English but aren't extremely comfortable using it, like if you're not very fluent, then you should probably use interpretation. This interview is too important to risk having a language-induced miscommunication hurt your chances for success. And another thing regarding interpretation, if you're using it, you've got to remember to speak slowly and use short sentences so the interpreter can render everything you say. You need to make frequent pauses so the interpreter doesn't get behind. Also, remember that the conversation you're having is with the asylum officer and not the interpreter. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes people will say things like, "Please tell the officer that I fear being harmed in my country." Well, that makes it sound like you're having a conversation with the interpreter rather than the officer. The better way to phrase that would be, "I fear being harmed in my country." Remember, the interpreter is just the medium through which the conversation takes place. They're not the person you're actually doing the interview with. Okay, next, the officer will ask you whether you can understand the interpreter who's on the phone, and then they'll ask you to take an oath. This is essentially a promise to tell the truth. You'll be asked to answer yes or no to a question along the lines of, do you affirm that you'll tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth during today's interview? The officer will ask whether you have a lawyer. If you do, you can have your attorney join in your interview. Your lawyer can sometimes join in person, but sometimes the asylum office will only allow an attorney to participate by phone. You should be sure to have your lawyer's phone number with you in case you need to give it to the officer so they can call your lawyer. If the officer can't reach your lawyer when they call them, or if you don't have a lawyer yet or would like to hire one before you have your interview, you may be able to postpone your interview. You can ask the officer to reschedule the interview. The asylum office is usually willing to do one such reschedule under these circumstances. Next, the officer will read from a pretty long form that explains the purpose of the interview and gives some advisals, like that you should ask for clarification if you don't understand a question the officer asks you. That's actually really important. You should never answer a question without fully understanding it. If you're not sure what the officer is asking you, you need to say that you don't understand and ask them to please repeat the question in different words or to otherwise clarify. Next, you'll be asked whether you have any health or other conditions or whether you're taking medications that could affect your ability to do the interview or your ability to remember things. They usually also ask how you were treated in detention if you are or were previously detained. Next, the officer will ask you biographical questions like your name, date of birth, and place of birth. The officer will ask what country you're a citizen of and whether you're a citizen of any other countries or have had permanent resident rights in any other country. The officer will ask what your religion is, if any, and whether you are married or perhaps lived with a partner. They'll ask how many children you have. If you're married or have a partner or have children, the officer will also ask for information about them and ask whether they came to the United States with you. You'll be asked what your current address is, or if detained, where and with whom you'll go if you were to be released. They'll ask about your profession and the highest level of education you completed. The officer may ask whether you have family members who have U.S. citizenship or permanent residence or have ever applied for asylum in the United States. They'll ask in which city you last lived in your home country, what countries you passed through en route to the United States, and whether you had legal immigration status in any such countries. If you were in other countries before coming to the United States, including even a layover at an airport in a third country, the officer will ask whether you applied for asylum or other humanitarian protection in such countries, and if not, why not? You'll be asked on which date you left your country and on which date and at what location you entered the United States. You may be asked whether you had help in arranging your trip or carrying out your travel to the United States. If you say yes, the officer will likely ask for details, including the names of the people who helped you. You may be asked about people you traveled with on the way to the United States and whether someone forced you to come to the United States or perhaps coerced you into going. This is to screen for human trafficking victims. Okay, at this point, the officer is going to start the questioning that really goes to the heart of your case. Questions gauged to determine whether you might have a viable claim for asylum or protection under the United Nations Convention Against Torture. They'll start this phase of the interview by asking you about bad things that have happened to you in the past, about times when you've been physically harmed or threatened. The officer will likely ask something like, have you ever been physically harmed in your country? If you say yes, they'll probably ask you how many times. On how many separate occasions have you been physically harmed in your country? You should therefore think ahead of time about how to answer this question. If it's happened so many times that you can't count it accurately, or if you're just not sure, then you should try to give your best estimate, but be sure to provide the caveat that it's just an estimate and you're not exactly sure about the precise number. This is the longest part of the interview, the part where the officer asks about things that have already happened to you that can be considered harm, and about circumstances that indicate that you may be harmed in the future. I'll say more about how to answer these substantive questions in the next section of our training. So next, after the substantive questions about what has happened to you and why you're afraid to go back to your country, the officer will ask you what are referred to as security questions or BAR questions. What does that mean? Well, these are questions gauged to see if you might be a terrorist or otherwise pose a threat to the United States, and furthermore, whether there might be something in your history that makes you ineligible for certain types of humanitarian protection, including asylum. The security questions are things like, have you ever used violence to hurt someone or damage property? And have you ever been a member of or provided any kind of support to a group that uses violence to achieve its goals? They'll ask whether you've ever committed a crime in any country, and probably also whether you've been accused of committing a crime. It's important to think carefully about that last one. I've seen lots of people answer no to that question despite having said just moments earlier in their interview that, for example, corrupt police officers detained them and called them a traitor and said they were going to be tried for treason, even though any such charge would be completely ridiculous. In my view, this still counts as an accusation, such that the applicant should say yes when responding to the question about whether they've ever been accused of committing a crime. This illustrates an important point. You've got to listen carefully to all of these bar and security questions, even though it may sound like, hey, you know what? This is ridiculous. They're asking if I'm a terrorist, and I'm not a terrorist, so I'm just going to immediately say no to all of these questions. Well, don't do that. Depending on your history and how the officer phrases the questions, you might need to answer with a yes. So listen carefully to each and every question and think carefully about the proper response. Also, the officer will ask you what countries you've been in other than your home country in the United States. This may be relevant for assessing security concerns, and it may also have implications for a bar to asylum called firm resettlement, which we'll talk about in a minute in more detail. Finally, either right before the bar and security questions or right after them, the officer will ask you whether there's anything you'd like to add. They'll ask you if there's anything that you haven't already talked about in terms of your story that you'd like to discuss, or anything in general that you'd like the officer to know. Now, some people take this as an opportunity to beg for asylum. They'll exclaim how wonderful the United States is, and how it's a beacon of freedom and hope, and how they promise they'll honor America every day if the government will just give them this chance, if it will just give them asylum. Please, don't do that. I promise you it will not help your case. If there really is something that you think is important that you haven't told the officer, then by all means, feel free to discuss it here. Try to do so in a succinct, to-the-point manner, because by this point, the officer's about ready for the interview to be over, and they don't want you to drag it out a bunch. But I assure you, it's perfectly fine, and indeed probably normally the most appropriate route, to just say, nope, nothing to add. Probably the last questions you'll get are, have you understood my questions today? And if you're using interpretation, were you able to understand the interpreter? And do you believe they understood you? Next, the officer will draft a very short summary of your testimony. They'll likely tell you to just hold on for about 5 or so minutes while they do this. They'll then read to you the summary they wrote. It will probably just be a few sentences. This is not meant to be exhaustive. Rather, it's just meant to capture the essence of your situation. What has happened to you, what you fear could happen to you, and why you're being targeted for harm. The officer will ask you whether you agree that the summary is correct. Now, this is kind of tricky. It's almost certain that the summary won't be that good. You'll feel it does not do your case justice. Like it leaves out lots of important stuff. But I honestly don't think it's usually worth fighting over this unless you believe that they've either gotten something wrong or they've neglected to mention that you've been harmed or threatened. Once you say that the summary sounds correct, the officer will read to you, or have the interpreter read to you, some additional information about the processing of your case. It explains what the possible outcomes are, which I will explain to you in just a minute. So, what's next? Well, if you're doing an in-person credible fear interview, this will almost certainly mean a lot of waiting on your part. You see, the officer will need to make a decision in your case and then do some paperwork for the case, which can take a few minutes. But what can really take a while is getting their supervisor to sign off on that decision. You see, every decision must be approved by a supervisor, and the supervisors are busy and aren't always available to act immediately on a request to review a credible fear case. And once they are available, reviewing it and completing the formalities to sign off on it takes some time. And that's not all. Next, an administrative support team has to package up certain documents for your case, and then they've got to serve it on you, which basically means they've got to have someone relay the decision and explain some things to you. What are you doing? Edit to what are you? What are you doing during all this, during the time between the end of the interview and actually getting your decision served on you? Well, you'll almost certainly just be sitting in the room where you had your interview, waiting. Waiting with nothing to do, perhaps for hours. They might let you in the waiting room, or perhaps even leave the office and have you come back a couple hours later, but they'll more likely just ask you to sit and wait in the interview room. When they do explain the decision to you, they'll give you a copy of documents related to your case. It's very important that you keep track of this packet and don't let anything happen to it. You or your lawyer will need it for future immigration proceedings. I highly recommend that you take it to a place like the UPS store or FedEx or OfficeMax and have them scan the entire packet into a single PDF document which you can store digitally for safekeeping and easy access in the future. So, what happens next? After your interview is done and you've gotten your decision? Well, if you get a positive credible fear decision, you'll have the chance to actually apply for asylum by submitting an asylum application. You'll then get to present your case in full to try to convince the decision maker that you qualify and should be allowed to stay. If you get a negative credible fear decision, they'll ask you at the asylum office after they deliver that decision to you whether you want an immigration judge to review that negative decision. This is kind of like an appeal. Unless you've decided for whatever reason that you just don't want to fight your case anymore, then you should say that yes, you want an immigration judge to review the negative decision. If you do that, a judge will later review the case and, after asking you perhaps a handful of questions, make a decision. If she affirms or agrees with the asylum officer's negative decision, then you could be deported very soon, unfortunately. But if the judge disagrees with the asylum officer, then you'll be allowed to apply for asylum and keep fighting your case. In either event, whether you get a positive or negative decision, I really do think you should talk with an asylum lawyer about how they may be able to help you with the next phase of your case. All right, with that, we're wrapping up part 2 of this credible fear interview training and turning to part 3. In this part of our interview training, I'm going to tell you what it is that the asylum officer really wants to know. I'm going to share with you what it is they're looking for, which will help you to prepare for your interview. Because you see, if you know what the officer is interested in, it will help you to decide what to focus on in providing answers to the officer's questions. While it's true that you should always try to give the most direct answer possible to the questions being asked, there will be times when you could answer a given question multiple ways, and you have to make a decision about what to say. The officer won't just let you go on and say whatever you want. Rather, your chance to express yourself and provide crucial information is very limited at your interview. So you've got to make the most of every opportunity to give the officer the information they need to understand that, yes, your circumstances do in fact make you qualified for asylum. And you'll be better positioned to do that if you understand what's actually important in the officer's eyes. Now, I know you've probably been through a lot, and all of that is important. Your life experiences do matter, but you've got to understand the laws on asylum and the policies of the Department of Homeland Security dictate that you've got to check certain specific boxes to qualify for asylum. And most people don't know what those boxes are. In other words, they don't actually know what the requirements to win asylum are. And lots of things that people may think are helpful in their case really aren't. Because of this, asylum applicants often spend a lot of time trying to focus on things that don't actually help their case. And they might not be conveying to the officer the information that actually would help their case. You can help ensure this doesn't happen to you by understanding what the officer actually needs to know. Now, this training is not legal advice or a legal service, so I'm not going to get into the specifics of the asylum laws. But I can tell you that, based on my experience as an asylum officer, there are 2 main aspects of any asylum case. They are persecution and nexus. What on earth does that mean? Well, persecution basically means serious harm. The officer wants to know if you've been seriously harmed in the past or if there's a reasonable possibility that you'll be seriously harmed in the future. All right, so for harm to count as persecution, I said it's got to be serious harm, right? Well, what does serious harm mean? What kind of harm is bad enough to count as serious harm and thus be considered persecution? Well, this is kind of a gray area. The officer has to make a subjective judgment about whether what has happened to you is, and whether what may happen to you in the future would be, so bad that it counts as persecution. Now, being truly tortured, like having your fingernails pulled out and being waterboarded and enduring electric shocks, well, that kind of harm would definitely rise to the level of persecution. Getting shot with a gun or beaten up really badly such that you have serious injuries that require you to stay in the hospital almost certainly would count as persecution as well. On the other hand, getting pushed around and maybe shoved down and then harassed some probably would not be enough to count as persecution. Note that psychological harm that you suffer can count as persecution too. It doesn't have to be just physical harm to your body. So for example, if someone has a mock execution performed on them, like a gun is put to their head and the person holding it says they're going to kill the person and they even pull the trigger, but there's no bullet in the chamber so it doesn't fire. Well, this could be enough to count as persecution if it ends up causing severe anguish in the victim. Like if this traumatic incident causes them to become depressed and have all kinds of problems such that they need therapy, this incident alone could be enough to count as persecution. And note that multiple not so severe incidents of harm, whether physical or psychological, can be added up to get to that persecution threshold. In other words, a bunch of small things that have happened to you, including sustained harassment and threats, may be enough to get you asylum, even if you've never been seriously physically harmed. So, to assess whether you've been harmed in a way that's serious enough to be considered persecution, you can count on the officer asking you questions like, have you ever been physically harmed in your country? And if so, on how many separate occasions have you been physically harmed? When you describe an incident of harm, the officer will ask you what injuries you suffered. They'll also ask whether you sought medical care for the injuries, and if so, what diagnosis you received and what the treatment plan was. They'll probably ask how long it took for your injuries to heal. The officer will also ask about threats and anything else that has been harmful to you. They will also ask about threats and any circumstances that indicate someone may be likely to hurt you in the future. And for the purpose of exploring psychological harm to you, so that they can make a decision on the severity issue and whether the harm is severe enough to count as persecution, the officer will ask how what you've been through in your country has affected you. They may ask, they may ask whether you've sought care from a mental health professional, like a therapist, psychologist, or psychiatrist, to help you deal with the psychological aspects of the trauma you've endured. In response to a broad, open-ended question like, how has what you've been through in your country affected you? It would be appropriate to mention things like having nightmares or trouble sleeping or feeling fearful or anxious or depressed, if any of those is in fact true of your situation. Okay, so that's the persecution part of the asylum analysis. What about the other main aspect? Remember what I said earlier that this other aspect is called? Well, in the asylum officer world, they call this nexus. And that's just a fancy word that means connection. But in the world of asylum, it's used in a way that's closer to motivation or reason. You see, it's not enough just to show that you have been or will be persecuted. You've also got to convince the asylum officer that the persecution was, or would be, motivated by one of 5 particular things about you. You see, our asylum laws only protect people from certain types of persecution. Only persecution that's centered on one of the 5 protected characteristics set out in the law. You've got to show the officer that you possess at least one of these 5 protected characteristics, and that it's at least one of those characteristics that's causing the bad guys to want to harm you. So, what are these 5 protected characteristics? They're a person's race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or something called membership in a particular social group. Now, we're not going to go into detail in this training about what each of those means. That stuff gets pretty complicated and is beyond the scope of this training. But let me just say that you can expect the officer to ask you questions at your interview that are meant to understand the persecutor's motives. The officer needs to assess what it is that's motivating the persecutor to target you for harm. Because to grant asylum, the persecution, the grave harm, has to be motivated, at least in significant part, by the fact that you possess, or at least the persecutor's belief that you possess, one of the 5 protected characteristics under U.S. asylum law. And to make that determination, the officer will ask you questions like, what did they say when they first approached you? And what did they say during and after the incident? This is because a person's words often indicate what their motives are. The officer will ask you questions about circumstances generally that may help them piece together the persecutor's motives. So you should be ready to talk at your interview about things that have been said around any incidents of harm or threats, and about any other circumstances that may indicate why it is that you've been targeted for harm. In other words, what is it about you that makes the bad guys want to harm you? And how do we know that this thing is in fact what's motivating them to get you? Okay, so we've covered persecution and nexus, which are the 2 main substantive things in your case. But you can also expect questions at your interview related to the identity of the persecutors. Are they from the government, or are they instead private citizens? And how do you know this? What makes you so sure? This distinction between private actors and the government is important because if the bad guys are private citizens, then to get asylum, the officer will have to be convinced that the government is either unable or unwilling to control the bad guys. To make that determination, in cases where the persecutors aren't from the government, the officer will ask questions about whether you reported any harm or threats to the authorities, and if not, why not? If you did report, they'll ask whether the authorities took your complaint seriously and what, if anything, ended up happening as a result of it. The officer may also ask questions to determine whether there's any ties between the bad guys and the police in your town or region, like whether you're aware of any collaboration between the two, and if so, how you know about it. The officer will ask whether you think you could be safe if you were to just move somewhere new in your country. This is called internal relocation. The idea is that you don't really need asylum in the United States if you could just go somewhere else in your own country and be safe. You'll get multiple questions about this if the bad guys are private citizens rather than people who work for the government. The officer will also ask about any aspects of moving to a new place that would be especially hard on you or your family. For example, if your child needs special medical attention that's only available in the country's capital, and that's where you used to live and where the bad guys are, then this would be relevant to the officer's internal relocation analysis. Finally, if you were physically present in any countries after you last left your country and before you arrived in the United States, like if you traveled by land through Mexico, for example, or even had a short layover in a third country to catch a connecting flight, then you can expect questions about whether you had an immigration status in any such country and what that status was. This is because of something called firm resettlement, which I mentioned earlier, which essentially says that you can't get asylum in the United States if you were in a country where you had permission to stay permanently, but you chose not to and just continued on to the United States. It's actually a complicated topic, but that's the thrust of it. So expect questions about it at your interview. All right. Now, what we've covered in this section of the training is not the entire universe of what you may be questioned about. But these things, persecution and nexus, and then the identity of the persecutor, internal relocation, and firm resettlement, will definitely come up in some form or fashion at your interview, so I wanted you to be aware of them. That way, you can start thinking now about how you may address questions that are aimed to explore these topics. You can be prepared to give the officer the most important information in a succinct, clear fashion, and doing so will help your case. Okay, now you know what will happen the day of your interview in terms of the different procedures and the parts of the interview, and you also know what the asylum officer is looking for. You know why they're asking the questions that they're asking for purposes of determining whether you qualify for humanitarian protection in the United States. So let's turn now to some concrete tips for how to answer questions at your interview. That's what we're discussing here in part 4, the final section of your Credible Fear interview training. To be sure, the way that you handle yourself at your interview, including how you go about answering the questions being asked, can go a long way toward determining whether you'll be successful. For starters, it's crucial that you understand exactly what the officer is asking you, and that you answer those questions and respond to all instructions as directly as possible. As I said earlier, if you don't understand a question, you've got to seek clarification. Do keep that in mind. It's very important. Now, let me give you an example of how to respond to questions directly. I want to demonstrate what a direct response to a question or instruction looks like, and what it looks like when someone fails to do this. If the asylum officer says, "On approximately how many separate occasions have you been physically harmed in your country?" you may be tempted to say something like, "Officer, I've been harmed so badly, these people want to kill me. They wouldn't stop coming for me. And the pain from the attacks, I can't even begin to tell you how I've suffered." Now, it's understandable that you'd want to express all this, but it doesn't answer the question, does it? And that's a problem. You see, you want to make the asylum officer's life as easy as possible. You want to give them the information they're asking for while highlighting the most important aspects of your case in deciding exactly which information to offer in responding to questions. When someone doesn't listen carefully to the question and gives a meandering response, like the example I just gave, which doesn't answer the question, you're going to frustrate the officer. You don't want to do that. Instead, a more direct, responsive answer to the question would be something like, "Officer, I've been physically attacked 4 times, and I've also been threatened and harassed many times." This answer is responsive to the question because it tells the officer how many times the person's been physically harmed. That's what the officer asked about. but it also gives a bit of unsolicited information. The officer did not ask about threats or harassment, but the person in this example offered up that information anyway. And I think it's fine to do so. It's okay to give the officer a bit more information than they asked for in responding to a question, as long as it's relevant to your case and you keep it short. In this example, it's good for the officer to know that you've suffered harm beyond just physical attacks. The officer will probably ask you questions about this anyway, even without you offering it up, but it can only help to ensure that it's on the record just in case the officer neglects to explore harm that you've suffered other than physical harm. Okay, next up, you should never ever tell the officer something just because you think they want you to say it, or maybe you feel like they expect you to say it. For example, going back to the question about how many times a person has been physically harmed in their country, if you've never been physically harmed, you should just say as much in response to that question. It's kind of a cultural thing, at least in certain cultures, for people to feel like they have to offer a response to satisfy a question in a certain way. If the officer is asking how many times a person was physically harmed, it kind of sounds like the officer expects the person to come back with a number. And so the person may feel pressure to say they've been physically harmed, even if they haven't. You can't do that. You just need to tell the truth and be straightforward in your responses. Does that make sense? Okay. And don't just guess while responding to questions. If you don't know the answer, just say as much. I assure you it's perfectly fine to say, I don't know, or I can't remember. Those are perfectly acceptable answers, and it's much better than just guessing or making something up. But what about cases where you think you know the answer, but you're not positive? Well, you need to express this to the officer. Express that you believe you know the information they're asking for, but you're not positive. Let's go back to our example of being asked about instances of physical harm. If you were attacked, like punched and kicked, on 3 occasions, but then were just shoved, but not really injured or otherwise harmed on 2 additional occasions, you might be unsure how to answer this question. Did the 2 instances of being shoved count as physical harm, such that you would say you've been physically harmed 5 times, or do only the more serious incidents count, so that you would answer with 3? After all, it's tough to know what the officer has in mind when she uses the phrase physical harm. In a situation like this, a good answer might be, I've suffered 3 serious attacks and been shoved on 2 additional occasions. With that answer, you're not giving a concrete, definitive single number, but you're adequately addressing the question and you're giving the officer relevant information. You see, all instances of harm, whether grave or not, are relevant to your case, so you do want the officer to know about the times you were shoved. Now, you may get questions that you've got at least some idea how to answer, but you can't pin it down with confidence. For example, the officer may ask something like, how many threatening phone calls did you receive? And you might not be in a position to give a specific number. I've had clients who have received too many threatening calls to count them all, upwards of 50 or even 100. In this case, where you're really not sure, it's best to estimate and to tell the officer that you're estimating. For example, an acceptable answer could be something like, I've received so many threatening calls that I can't really keep track of them. I believe there have been at least 20, but that's an estimate. See what we did there? We told the officer we weren't positive, but we still gave them a sense for the magnitude of the problem by saying there were likely at least 20 such calls. This concept applies to all aspects of your testimony and not just the number of times something happened. When you believe you know the answer but you're not positive, you should express this. For example, a question that everyone can expect if they've ever been physically harmed or threatened is, what did they say? As discussed in the prior section of this training, the answer to this is crucial to the officer analyzing the motive for the harm against you, which is in turn a key part of your case. And one of the ways the officer explores this is by examining the words of the people who have harmed you or whom you fear. But let's be honest, you probably don't remember the exact words that people who harmed or threatened you used, or at least not every single word, right? I mean, we're just not very good at remembering the exact words that people use. Can you repeat verbatim everything I've said in this training over the last 2 minutes? Probably not, right? And the things the officer is asking you to recall might have happened a long time ago and likely occurred under difficult or even traumatic circumstances. So it may be very hard for you to remember what words were used. So if the officer is discussing with you a particular incident in your past and they ask you, what did the bad guys say to you? You're not expected to quote them verbatim, but you should try to recite anything that you do definitely remember them saying. For example, a response could be something like this. The incident was a long time ago and it all happened so fast, so I don't remember everything they said or all the exact words used. But there was one thing that really stood out. I do remember that they said, "We know you support the political opposition and that you've been protesting the government. And you know bad things happen to people who do that," or words to that effect. You see, with that answer, you're kind of hedging. You're leaving open the prospect that other things were said, but you're giving the officer useful information that's directly relevant to your claim, because these threatening words suggest a political motive in targeting you. And notice how I used at the end of the sample response the phrase, "or words to that effect." This is for the purpose of expressing that this is basically what was said, but it might not be verbatim. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, because if the officer later asks you during this interview, or if you one day end up being asked about it in immigration court, what did they say to you? And you say something that's basically along the same lines, but it's not exactly the same, well, it won't look like an inconsistency in your testimony. You see, it's unlikely that you'll repeat those threatening words in exactly the same way if asked about them later. If you originally said that they used words to that effect or something along those lines, then you've kind of bought yourself some flexibility. The officer or immigration judge, should you end up in immigration court, can't later say, "Well, you originally said that the bad guy said X, and now you're telling us that they said Y, and those two things don't match up, so you're therefore not credible." To be clear, if you're absolutely positive of the exact words someone used, or of the exact circumstances of whatever it is you're recounting in your interview, then feel free to use them without adding the kind of caveats that I've been discussing. But if you have any doubt, it may be helpful to use words like approximately or about, or phrases like more or less, or something to that effect, or along those lines. These words and phrases provide a bit of flexibility and may reduce the chances that your testimony will be viewed as inconsistent if you later say something or provide information that's not exactly in line with what you originally said. All right, moving on. A very common question when you're describing an incident and you've already told the officer about something the bad guys said is, "Did they say anything else?" Or, "What else did they say?" Asylum officers love to ask this question. Why? A charitable view would be that they really just want to understand your situation, so they're asking for more information that will help with that. But in practice, I've seen asylum officers use this question as a weapon or a trap. What do I mean by that? Well, let me give you an example to show you how this works. Early in your interview, you might tell the officer that the person who threatened you in a phone call said A, B, and C. The officer may ask, "Did they say anything else?" And you might say, "No." Similarly, the officer might ask, "What else did they say?" And in that moment, you might not remember the people saying anything else other than A, B, and C. So you respond to the officer by saying, "No, they didn't say anything else," or "Nothing." But then later in the interview, the officer may say, "Hey, tell me again what they said to you during that call." And you may say, "Sure, they said A, B, C, and D." Well, that can be a problem. The officer can say, "Wait a minute, earlier you said that they said A, B, and C, and I asked if they said anything else, and you said no. But now you're saying something different. Now you're saying that they also said D." When this happens, the officer can consider this to be an inconsistency in your testimony, and it can hurt your case. But you can avoid this trap, or at least soften the blow from it, by hedging when you describe things people said or things that have happened. For example, remember how a couple minutes ago in an example I said, "The incident was a long time ago and it all happened so fast, so I don't remember everything they said or all the exact words they used"? Well, that's the kind of language that signals that what you're recounting for the officer is what you can remember at that moment, but that there might be more that happened. That way, if the officer later says, "Wait, but now you're telling me something additional, which you failed to mention earlier," it looks better for you. You've diminished the officer's ability to hold this against you. The same idea applies to other aspects of your testimony beyond just describing what people said or did. For example, if the officer asks how many times someone punched you, and you're not absolutely sure of the answer, saying something like, "I'm not positive, but I believe it was at least 10 times, would be better than just throwing out a concrete number and making it sound like that's definitely exactly how many times they hit you. If you think it was around 12 times, and you say, "They punched me 12 times," but then later say, or the evidence in your case indicates, that it was in fact 14 times, this could be a problem. But if you had originally said around 10 or approximately 10 or at least 10 times, then you would be okay. Okay, Let's talk about the length of your answers. You should keep them short. The officer is overwhelmed with a crushing amount of work, and they want to get through your case as quickly as possible. If you're giving them long-winded answers, you're almost certainly including a lot of information the officer doesn't need, and you're only going to make them dislike you and your case. You've got to listen very carefully to the exact question being asked and answer it directly in a concise, to-the-point manner. If the officer asks, "Who are you afraid of in your country?" you should not respond with, "Officer, as you may know, my country has endured decades of political turbulence, with each successive administration being worse than the last in their respect for human rights and democracy. It is in this context that my problems arose starting around 2017, when I was first threatened by the secret police, whom I now fear will imprison and torture me." Okay, that's just way too long. Moreover, the asylum officer doesn't need a history lesson about your country. You see, they're almost certainly at least somewhat familiar with conditions in your country, owing to their experience with cases of other people from your country. They do their own research on these issues, exploring what is called country of origin information or country conditions information, which includes things like reports from governments, nonprofit organizations, and media outlets about the situation in your country. You see, and this is a really important point to keep in mind, at your interview, the officer is interested in you and your personal experiences, and much less so in your country. It's tempting to want to ensure that the officer really gets the context back home, but I promise you it's counterproductive to do so. So during your interview, don't try to educate the officer about conditions in your country, except to the extent that it's absolutely necessary for them to understand your case. Okay, so let's return to the question. Who are you afraid of in your country? And let me tell you how this could have been answered more appropriately. Remember how our hypothetical applicant gave a rambling answer? Well, it made reference to the secret police. That's who he fears. So an appropriate answer to the question, therefore, would be simply, "I fear the secret police." That's it. No need to elaborate. You've answered the question. But speaking of elaboration, let me address here a question I often get. Should you answer a yes-no question with just the word yes or no, or is it a good idea to say a bit more? Now, this may sound like it goes against what I just said about no need to elaborate with regard to the example about who do you fear in your country, but I actually do think it's often helpful to expound a bit where the question is one that's meant to elicit a yes or no answer. For example, if your case is based on political persecution and the officer says, "Were you a member of a political party in your country?" And though you maybe weren't formally a member of one, you supported a party and were very involved with it. For example, you might not have ever signed papers that said you were joining, and you might not have a membership card. But if you went to the political party's meetings and you joined with it for protests and things like that, then you do want the officer to know this. So instead of answering the question, "Were you a member of a political party in your country?" with a simple no, you could consider something like this. "No, while I wasn't formally a member, I was actively involved with one of the opposition political parties called," and then whatever the name may be. Okay, so that's it for this section of the training. I commend you for staying with me. You must be serious about having the best interview possible, and I appreciate that. That's great. We've covered a lot in this training, so I really do think you'll go into your interview better prepared and more comfortable than you would have had we not spent this time together. But if you want to go even deeper, if you want personalized guidance ahead of your interview, or if you want to consider hiring a lawyer to actually represent you at your credible fear interview, then my team and I would love to talk to you. It starts with a strategy session where we'll discuss your situation and we'll tell you in detail how my law firm might be able to help you. It doesn't matter where you are in the United States. We help people all over the country, and we'll do your strategy session through a video conference, so it doesn't matter if we're not in the same area. So to get that set up, to schedule your strategy session, call us today at 713-909-0401. Once again, that number is 713-909-0401. So call us to set that up, or you can actually schedule it yourself online by going to my website, www.manningasylumlaw.com. You can see it on your screen. I hope you've enjoyed this training as much as I've enjoyed making it for you. Thanks, and I hope to have the chance to support you in your asylum journey.